And since Mark's story doesn't wrap up all the loose ends, and I know we have it in other Gospels, but imagine with me for a moment. Mark encourages us to go back to the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, Messiah, Son of God, and to begin to read this story as your and my story. Mark invites us back to the beginning. But a couple of things as we conclude our time this morning. A couple of concluding thoughts as we end the gospel together. First, we find in Mark's gospel the king who identifies with the suffering of his people, yes? I think there's a pervasive shallowness that's existed for centuries within our church culture, a shallowness that I think stands in direct contradiction to the gospel. Here it is. We tend to overemphasize the deity of Jesus with the expense of the humanity of Jesus. We prioritize the otherness of God at the expense of the humanness of God. We prioritize the holiness of God with the expense of God's identification with human suffering. We prioritize the transcendence of God at the expense of God's nearness to his people and to those who suffer. And there's a balancing act to be had here, but I think what we lose in this prioritization is the controlling image of the cross, the fullest revelation of God in Jesus as he lays down his life in suffering. And here it is. We often ask questions like these. Where is God? Maybe you're here this morning and that's your question. Where is God if evil is present in the world? Where is God while humans are hungry and thirsty and homeless and exiles and refugees? Where is God when an innocent person dies as a result of violence and terrorism and tyranny and war? Where is God in the midst of economic, social, and political injustice? Where is God in the midst of disease and racism and addiction and exploitation and human trafficking? Where is God? And what we find is that God is with them. God suffers alongside of them. Jesus above them and below them and beside them and within them suffers as they suffer. Jesus has experienced in the cross and in his life the plight of human suffering, and he identifies intimately with your human weakness, your need, and your pain. He is not a God who is distant and does not understand. He is a God who understands and feels what you feel deeply. The legitimacy of Jesus' birth was doubted. His family considered him out of his mind. He was betrayed by his closest friends. He was falsely accused. He was tried by a prejudiced jury and convicted by a cowardly judge. He was brutally tortured by beating and execution. He was mocked and reviled by his own people. And perhaps worst of all, he died tragically and terribly alone. Jesus withstood the brutality of human existence. Jesus walked through valleys of shadow of death. And listen, there is no place that your feet will step that Jesus has not already walked before you. He is with you in your suffering. He takes on the ugliness and the shame and the weakness of our humanity. He fully committed himself to the human condition. We are bound to God in suffering, church. May you know. As Jürgen Moltmann writes, when we feel pain, we participate in God's pain. And when we grieve, we share in his grief. People who believe in the God who suffers with us recognize their suffering in God and God in their suffering. May you know that Jesus identifies with you in your suffering.